In the glittering halls of Newport's Gilded Age, where fortunes are flaunted and reputations can shatter in a single evening, a young seamstress is offered the unthinkable: marriage to a ruined widower whose name carries both mystery and scandal. But behind his piercing gaze and solemn silence lies a truth that could upend everything she believes. Was she chosen as a partner or as a pawn in a dangerous game of power and survival? Tonight, you'll witness a story of betrayal and redemption, of masks torn away and love reborn in the fire of adversity. Tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about timeless romances like this one? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1887. The sea breeze swept inland with a salt-tinged melancholy, brushing through the lace curtains of the modest boarding-house room where Vivian Clark bent once more over her sewing frame. Her fingers, thin and calloused, moved with the mechanical precision of habit, pulling the thread through a hem she had stitched 100 times before. The light of late afternoon filtered through the window panes, casting golden lines across her faded blue cotton dress, the only one she owned suitable for daytime calls. Vivian had been working since dawn. A rush order from Mrs. Carlyle, one of the wealthiest and most demanding summer residents of Newport, had kept her from taking lunch. Now, the dress was finished. Pale lilac silk with cream appliques, stitched with the meticulous care only someone who needed every cent could deliver. She wrapped the gown carefully in tissue, tied it with a ribbon, and tucked it into a linen-lined hat box. Her eyes, though tired, remained bright with pride. Perhaps, just perhaps, Mrs. Carlyle would offer another commission, or at least pay without complaint. Vivian's rent was due by week's end, and her father's medicine, sent up weekly from Providence, had grown more expensive with each passing month. The sun was still high when she walked the cobbled street toward Bellevue Avenue, where the mansions loomed behind wrought-iron gates like fortresses of dreams. Her worn boots clicked softly on the stones. She avoided the carriages that passed, heads turned away from glances that lingered too long on her plain attire. She didn't belong here, not truly, but her hands, her work, were permitted to enter where her name never would. Mrs. Carlyle received her on the back veranda, surrounded by friends. Laughter floated like perfume in the summer air, mingling with the clinking of porcelain cups and the rustle of silk skirts. "Ah, the seamstress," Mrs. Carlyle said aloud, waving a gloved hand without turning. "Just leave it with Miriam." Vivian stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I was instructed to deliver it directly, ma'am." That earned her a few sidelong glances and a stifled chuckle from one of the younger women. Mrs. Carlyle finally turned. "And you've done so. Kindly don't linger. We don't receive trade in the afternoon." A flush rose to Vivian's cheeks. She lowered her gaze, nodded silently, and placed the box on the servant's bench. The laughter resumed as she stepped away. She walked the long road back with a heart heavier than the hatbox had been. Pride was a delicate thing. It did not survive long in the world she inhabited. Still, she held her head high as she returned to the boarding house and climbed the narrow stairs to her room. The note was waiting for her on the dresser, folded once, sealed with dark blue wax. No name, no sender. She opened it with trembling fingers. "Miss Clark, your work has been brought to my attention. I require your skill for a private commission. Please deliver it in person to my residence at dusk. H.B." She read it twice. The initials stirred something distant in her memory. H.B. "Could it be?" she asked the landlady. "Yes, dear, that'd be Mr. Henry Blackwell," the older woman confirmed, wiping flour from her hands. "Lives up on Beechwood Avenue near the old Astor property. Never sees visitors. Widower. Some say he went mad with grief. Others say he's hiding from creditors." Vivian hesitated. Every part of her told her not to go. But dusk found her walking toward Blackwell House, the estate long thought uninhabited. Its tall hedges and rusted gate creaked as she passed through. The path was overgrown, the air still and heavy with lavender. She knocked once, then again. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a tall man in a dark waistcoat, his silhouette framed by the fading light. Henry Blackwell was not what she expected. His face was marked by time and solitude, grey at the temples, jaw set with quiet authority, eyes a piercing shade of blue that held hers in silence. "You're Miss Clark," he said. She nodded, voice catching. "You sent for me, sir?" He stepped aside, gesturing her in. "I did. Come in." The interior was elegant but dim, as if the house itself had chosen to forget its own splendor. Shadows clung to the walls. Vivian's breath quickened as she crossed the threshold. They spoke little. He led her to a parlor where an unfinished gown lay across a chaise. "This was to be Catherine's," he murmured, "but she's gone now." Vivian's throat tightened. "I'm sorry for your loss." He turned to face her then, gaze unreadable. "You are young, capable, and discreet." She waited. "I need a wife," he said simply. "Not for affection, for structure, for companionship, for the illusion of stability in a world obsessed with appearances." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I can provide a home, food, comfort. You would want for nothing," he continued. "In exchange, I ask only your presence and your silence. It is not a romantic offer, Miss Clark, but it is a sincere one." Her heart pounded like a drum in her ears. He stepped closer but did not touch her. "You needn't answer now. Return tomorrow at noon. If you decline, I won't trouble you again." Then, without another word, he opened the door. The night air rushed in, cool and fragrant with sea and soil. Vivian walked out alone, the wind tugging at her skirts, her soul in turmoil. By the time she reached the edge of the road, the estate had vanished behind a veil of mist. And yet she felt as if the course of her life had just been irrevocably altered. She clutched the note still folded in her pocket, her fingers trembling around the wax seal. Nothing about this offer was ordinary. And yet something in his voice, in the way his eyes had lingered on hers, had stirred a question she could not silence. What could compel a man like Henry Blackwell to marry a woman like her? The answer, she feared, would not come without a cost. The rain began just before dawn, soft and persistent, tapping gently against the window panes of the small boarding house room. Vivian sat by the window, still in her nightdress, her knees drawn close to her chest. The letter from the previous night, folded and refolded in her trembling hands. Sleep had eluded her completely. Her mind had returned again and again to the man with the quiet voice and the haunted eyes, to the silence that had filled the rooms of his grand estate, and to the unthinkable offer he had made her. Outside, the cobbled streets of Newport glistened with morning drizzle. A milk cart passed, its wheels leaving dark trails behind. She felt as though the world continued on, without knowing that hers had been split in two. Her father, Ezra Clark, coughed from the adjoining room, a rough sound that tugged her back to reality. She rose, folded the letter once more, and slipped it into her apron pocket. She brought him a warm cloth for his forehead and sat beside him with a cup of weak tea. His face, once sun-browned and strong, had grown gaunt. His hands, once calloused from years working the docks, now trembled when he lifted the cup. "You look troubled, girl," he rasped. Vivian hesitated. Then, without fully meeting his eyes, she told him about the letter, about the estate, about Henry Blackwell, and the proposal that felt more like a riddle than an invitation. Her father listened in silence. When she finished, he set the cup down and took her hand gently in his. "Life doesn't always offer a woman choices dressed in silk, Vivian," he said. "Sometimes it comes wrapped in fog and whispers. But if this man is decent, if he means to offer you safety, dignity, I see no shame in accepting." "But I don't know him," she murmured, her voice thin, "and he doesn't love me." Her father looked at her with eyes full of weariness and clarity. "Love can come, or not, but hunger comes quicker. So does loneliness. And cold. I'd rather see you in a grand house than buried in a sewing room, worn out by 30. Vivian stood quietly after that, staring at the pale light pushing through the clouds. By noon, her feet carried her, almost without her willing them, back toward Beechwood Avenue. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy, the sky a sheet of grey silk above her. The gates of the Blackwell estate were ajar, as if expecting her. She entered. The butler, a tall and stoic man with greying hair and unreadable eyes, ushered her inside without a word. She waited in the drawing room, her heart pounding, the silence of the house wrapping around her like a second skin. Then he entered. Henry Blackwell stood in the doorway, his presence as composed as before, dressed in a deep charcoal morning coat, his cravat perfectly arranged. He regarded her for a moment, neither cold nor warm, before speaking. "You returned." Vivian nodded. I have. Have you come to refuse me?" She swallowed. "No." He studied her face as if trying to decipher a language unspoken. "Then we shall marry at once," he said. No flourish, no change in tone, simply a declaration of fact. She blinked. "So soon. I see no purpose in delay. The less gossip, the better. There are matters that require a wife by my side, though not necessarily at my side in the eyes of society. We will have privacy, and peace, if you wish it." He paused. "Do you accept these terms?" Vivian's voice came softer than a whisper. "I do." That same afternoon they were married in the study by a discreet reverend, his prayers murmured over the sound of distant rain against the glass. There were no flowers, no rings, no witnesses, only the echo of vows spoken in the presence of strangers. Vivian wore a pale lavender gown she had sewn for a client who never paid. Henry did not touch her hand, nor look her in the eyes as the ceremony concluded. He thanked the reverend, dismissed him, and then offered his arm to his bride, as one would to a business associate. "I will show you to your room," he said. They ascended the wide staircase in silence. The house loomed around her, walls panelled in dark mahogany, paintings hung in heavy gilt frames, carpets woven in deep reds and creams. Everything reeked of wealth and emptiness. He stopped before a door at the end of a long corridor. "This was to be your suite," he said. "You may alter it as you wish." Vivian stepped inside. The chamber was large, with tall windows veiled in ivory lace. A marble fireplace stood unlit. The bed, canopied and covered in brocade, seemed untouched. On the mantel stood a portrait. A woman, beautiful, blonde, pale as porcelain. Catherine. Vivian turned slowly. "Was this hers?" Henry's voice behind her was tight. "It was. I meant to remove it." She nodded, but said nothing. Later that evening she dined alone. A servant brought her soup and a glass of wine in the small salon adjacent to her room. She did not see Henry again that night. Days passed. The house seemed frozen in time. The servants moved silently, always proper, but never warm. They addressed her as Mrs. Blackwell, with mechanical politeness. No one offered conversation, no one asked questions. It was as if the entire estate operated on invisible rules no one dared break. Vivian wandered the halls when she wasn't in her room. She discovered a conservatory filled with wilting plants, a ballroom draped in dust sheets, a music room where a grand piano sat unopened. Every space bore traces of Catherine, her books, her perfumes, her presence. The woman was gone, but not absent. At dinner, Henry joined her only once. They spoke of nothing but weather and the price of coal. He asked if she was comfortable. She answered yes. Their eyes met only briefly. In those stolen glances there was something. Not warmth, not coldness, a flicker of something else entirely, recognition perhaps, as though they both understood that they were actors in a play neither had written and neither could escape. That night, as she undressed by lamplight, Vivian stood before the mirror brushing out her hair. She no longer recognized the woman in the glass. The lace nightgown she wore had been gifted by Henry's housekeeper, soft, delicate, and utterly foreign to her. She touched her throat, then her lips, remembering the way Henry's voice had trembled, barely for a moment when speaking of his late wife. What had brought him to this arrangement? What wound had driven him into silence? And what role was she truly meant to play in this house, wrapped in velvet and shadows? She extinguished the lamp and crawled into the bed that had once belonged to a stranger. The sheets were cold. The silence was colder. And as the moonlight slipped between the lace curtains, Vivian Clark, now Vivian Blackwell, closed her eyes, unsure if she had just saved herself or stepped into something far more dangerous than poverty ever was. The days that followed Vivian's quiet marriage were shrouded in stillness, like the lingering mist over Newport's shoreline at dawn. The grand estate that now bore her name felt less like a home and more like a living museum, suspended in time and tastefully mourning a woman whose absence was more present than her memory deserved. Each morning, Vivian awoke in the bridal suite once occupied by Catherine Blackwell, and each morning she was greeted not by warmth, but by velvet curtains that refused to sway, and walls that seemed to listen more than they welcomed. The servants maintained their rigid courtesy, but their glances, though quick, spoke volumes. She was not yet mistress in their eyes. She was tolerated, occupying a role once revered and now questioned. Her attempts to initiate conversation with the staff were met with polite evasion. The butler, Mr. Alden, answered with clipped formality. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitley, bowed with respect, but seldom stayed in a room longer than necessary. The others avoided her gaze altogether. Vivian spent her afternoons walking through echoing corridors, observing the relics of a life that had not been hers but now, by marriage, belonged to her. The library shelves still bore Catherine's monogrammed bookplates. Her perfumes, heady blends of rosewood and violet, lingered faintly in the dressing room. Her gloves were neatly folded in silk-lined drawers, untouched but not removed. Even the piano in the music room bore a single, long-forgotten sheet of music, with Catherine's delicate annotations in the margins. Vivian touched none of it. She felt like a ghost trespassing in another ghost's home. On the fourth evening of her stay, Mrs. Whitley entered the drawing-room with an envelope on a silver tray. "Mrs. Blackwell," she said without inflection, "you've been invited to the Harcourt Garden reception. Lady Prudence sends her regards." Vivian stared at the invitation, the fine gold script curling like vines across the card. The Harcourt name was one she had heard since her earliest days working in Newport. Their home, Rosemore Hall, stood at the pinnacle of Beechwood Avenue society. That Vivian would now be expected to walk through its gates on the arm of Henry Blackwell felt both surreal and terrifying. She looked to Mrs. Whitley. "Will Mr. Blackwell attend?" The housekeeper's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. "He has declined. He believes the occasion will benefit more from your presence than his." Vivian felt a pang, though she wasn't sure why. Later that evening, in the quiet solitude of her room, she chose a gown from the armoire, an ivory silk with pale green embroidery around the neckline. It was lovely, delicate, and she hadn't dared wear it yet. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the buttons. Her reflection in the mirror looked like someone else. A lady, yes, but one who wore elegance like a borrowed coat, never quite hers. The following afternoon, she was delivered to Rosemore Hall by carriage, her gloves crisp, her hat tilted just so. The estate was a vision of wealth. Fountains murmured in the gardens, and white roses spilled over marble balustrades like cascading lace. She stepped onto the lawn, heart thrumming, and immediately felt the weight of eyes upon her. The women were adorned in shades of lilac, butter yellow and powder blue, like a garden of moving blossoms. They turned toward her with practiced grace, smiles that did not reach their eyes. Mrs. Prudence Harcourt, regal in lavender taffeta and a wide-plumed hat, greeted her at the top of the marble steps with the poise of a queen and the chill of a January wind. "Mrs. Blackwell," she said, lips barely parting. "How unexpected." Vivian curtsied. "Thank you for your invitation, ma'am." "Mrs." Harcourt's eyes scanned her gown, her gloves, the slight curve of hesitation in her shoulders. "I hope you are finding the Blackwell estate manageable. It's not easy, I imagine, stepping into another woman's shoes." Vivian held her breath, her voice steady. "I never imagined I would." Another lady chuckled behind her fan. The conversation moved on without her. For the next hour, Vivian drifted among parasols and porcelain cups, smiling when expected, answering questions that were really veiled barbs. "Oh, you were a seamstress. How quaint. I suppose you must have exquisite taste in thread. Did you meet Henry through mutual acquaintances, or were you already acquainted through his household? My daughter once spent an evening speaking with Mr. Blackwell years ago. A brilliant match he would have made if not for his circumstances." Vivian endured it all with measured grace. She refused to let her voice tremble, but as she sipped her tea beneath a lace canopy, she caught one name repeated with subtle emphasis: Catherine. Always Catherine. Spoken in lowered tones, invoked in half-smiles and glances meant to pierce. Later that evening, back at the estate, she retreated to the east wing, a part of the house she had not yet explored. Curiosity, or perhaps defiance, pushed her forward. She entered a room that smelled of dried flowers and thyme. A boudoir. Feminine. Private. The walls were papered in a faded blue floral. The dressing table still held brushes, crystal perfume bottles, and silver-trimmed mirrors. Catherine's room. A diary sat unopened on the edge of the vanity. Vivian approached but did not touch it. A framed sketch rested beside it. Catherine, drawn in charcoal, her expression serene, ethereal, superior. A sound in the doorway made Vivian turn. Henry stood there, coat in hand, his shirt collar slightly undone, as though he had returned hurriedly from some business. "I didn't realize you ventured to this part of the house," he said quietly. Vivian stepped away from the vanity. "I was exploring." He nodded once, then walked past her and gently closed the diary, turning it inward so the cover faced the table. "There are things in this house," he said, voice lower now, "that should be left in peace." Vivian hesitated. "Did you love her?" His expression changed, just barely. "I was her husband. That wasn't my question." He looked at the sketch, then away. "She was everything society expected. Beautiful, accomplished, admired." A pause. "Some women are best remembered from a distance." Vivian searched his face for emotion, for regret, for anything unguarded. But his features were calm, carved in stone. She whispered, "Do you ever think of her? Not in the way they want me to." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the room where Catherine still lingered, immortalized not in mourning, but in comparison. That night, Vivian stood at her window and watched the fog roll in from the sea. Somewhere behind those trees, Rosemore Hall glittered with laughter and champagne. Somewhere her name was spoken in rooms she would never be invited into freely. And somewhere in the same house, Henry Blackwell kept his heart buried under years of silence. Vivian pressed her hand to the glass, the cool pain grounding her. This life was no longer a dream, nor was it a nightmare. It was simply unknown, and she was still a stranger in a mansion built for someone else. It was on the 10th morning of her new life that Vivian first stepped into the old library. The storm the night before had left the estate wrapped in a stillness almost reverent. The sky outside remained heavy with the weight of rain not yet fallen, and a thin mist clung to the windows. The servants moved quietly, as they always did, and Henry had already left the house before dawn, according to Mrs. Whitley, with no word of his return. Vivian, unable to endure another silent breakfast in the rose parlour, wandered aimlessly until her hand fell upon a doorknob she hadn't noticed before. The door creaked open to reveal a room steeped in shadow and dust, its air laced with the scent of old paper and cedar. The Blackwell Library was unlike anything she had seen before. High walls were lined from floor to ceiling with shelves carved in walnut and filled with leather-bound volumes, many of them with gilded spines and names in foreign tongues. A great globe sat in the corner near the fireplace, its oceans faded and continents marked by ancient borders. Two high-backed armchairs faced one another across a thick Persian rug, and the long desk by the tall arched window stood like a forgotten altar to a former life. She moved quietly across the room, fingertips grazing the spines of books older than her father. A velvet curtain, half drawn, allowed a faint stream of light to fall across the desk. She circled it slowly, noticing a drawer unlike the others, its surface smoother, less dusty, as though touched more recently. It was locked. She tried gently to open it. Nothing. A strange tension stirred in her chest. For reasons she could not name, she sought out Mr. Alden, the butler. She found him arranging linens in the hallway closet, and though his face remained as impassive as ever, there was the faintest flicker of something behind his eyes when she mentioned the library. "That drawer," she said softly. "It's locked. Do you have a key?" The old man paused. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he produced a small brass key from his vest pocket. "Mr. Blackwell keeps it secured for a reason, madam," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Vivian held his gaze. "I believe I have reason enough." Mr. Alden inclined his head once and followed her back to the library. The key slid in with ease. Vivian dismissed him politely and waited until she was alone before opening the drawer fully. Inside were bundles of parchment, ledgers, wax-sealed letters, and a small velvet pouch containing an engraved signet ring. Everything was perfectly arranged, every corner precisely aligned, as if the very documents breathed order and secrecy. Her hands trembled as she opened the first ledger. It bore Henry's handwriting, neat, mechanical, controlled. Numbers, codes, accounts linked to banks in New York, Boston, Chicago, notations in the margins, strategies, calculations, projected stock rises. Names she recognized from the social pages: industrialists, bankers, railroad barons. She turned to another book, this one recording transactions hidden beneath fabricated company names. Even to her untrained eyes, it was clear. Henry Blackwell was no ruined man. Far from it. He was a strategist, a silent architect of wealth, and his so-called fall from grace had been a mask, a calculated retreat into obscurity to protect his empire from enemies, from manipulation, from society's prying eyes. Vivian sat back in the chair, her breath shallow. He had lied to her, not with words, but with omissions, with shadows, with the quiet acceptance of false assumptions. Her heart thudded painfully. She rose slowly, hands still cold from the papers, and made her way out of the library with purpose. When Henry returned later that evening, soaked from the rain, she was waiting for him in the drawing room. The fire crackled low. She had not lit the lamps. The room glowed in amber and shadow. He entered, removing his gloves. At the sight of her, he paused. "You've been in the library," he said, as if reading it in her eyes. "Yes." She rose from her seat, voice steady. "You're not ruined," she continued. "You never were." He said nothing. The rain ticked softly against the windows. "You let me believe it," she pressed. "You let everyone believe it. Why?" Henry moved slowly to the hearth and removed his coat. He stared into the fire as he spoke. "Because ruin offers privacy," he said finally, "and wealth attracts leeches, thieves, opportunists. And wives?" she asked, her voice catching. His jaw tightened, but he didn't turn. "I never promised honesty, Vivian." She took a step forward. "You offered me a life built on shadows. Do I not deserve to know the walls I live behind? The man I married?" Now he turned. His eyes, ice blue and sharp, met hers. "You married me under no illusions," he said, his voice quiet but razor-edged. "You knew this wasn't a love match. You wanted security. I wanted silence. We agreed, without ever saying so, that truth was not required." Vivian stared at him, the pain blooming in her chest sharper than she expected. "I never asked for love," she said, "but I never agreed to be your pawn." Henry's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. No one enters this world without being used, Vivian. I simply gave you the terms up front. You chose them. She took another step, her voice trembling now. I chose dignity. You offered that, but this is not dignity. This is deception. He studied her, long and silent. Then he turned back toward the fire. I have enemies, he said. On Wall Street, in society, even in my own bloodline. I crafted my retreat carefully, let them think me ruined, let them forget I exist. It was safer that way, for my holdings and for myself. Vivian folded her arms, her breath shallow. Then why marry? Henry didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. Because I needed someone whose silence I could trust. Vivian recoiled as if slapped. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse. And you thought a poor seamstress would be grateful enough to be mute. He met her gaze again, this time with something flickering behind his calm facade. Shame, or perhaps regret. It passed too quickly to name. I misjudged you, he said softly. Silence filled the room, thick and aching. She turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. I would have kept your secrets, she said, not turning back, if you had trusted me with them. Then she walked out, the echo of her footsteps swallowed by the silence of the mansion. And Henry Blackwell, master of unseen fortunes and orchestrator of shadows, stood alone by the fire, his empire intact, but the one honest thing in his house quietly slipping through his fingers. A brittle wind swept through Newport as autumn crept in, and with it came a silence in the Blackwell estate that no fire could warm. The days had grown shorter, the skies heavy with pale grey clouds that seemed to press against the windows like hands searching for entry. Inside, Vivian moved like a shadow through the halls, speaking to no one unless spoken to, drifting from room to room with the quiet grace of someone who had forgotten how to belong. Since the confrontation in the drawing room, she had spoken no more than a handful of words to her husband. Meals were taken separately. Social engagements, already rare, were declined. Servants exchanged glances when passing her in the corridor, whispering behind doors that never fully closed. Her presence, once curious to the household, had become a subject of speculation. Vivian no longer entered the library. She could not bring herself to touch the ledgers again, nor face the ghost of her own disbelief. Trust had not been part of their arrangement, Henry had said, and yet something in her had hoped for it, something tender and foolish. At night, she sat by the window of her chamber, wrapped in a shawl, watching the fog roll in from the sea. She did not cry, not any more. The tears had dried after the second sleepless night, replaced by a quiet ache in her chest that did not fade with daylight. It was on a Tuesday morning, under a low sky the colour of pewter, that Eleanor Whitmore returned to her life. Vivian had first met Eleanor at Rosemore Hall, but their acquaintance had been brief and delicate, shadowed by the watchful eyes of society. Now, however, Eleanor arrived unannounced, stepping out of a polished carriage with a smile that defied the drizzle. She wore a sage-green wool coat trimmed in sable and a hat perched slightly to the side, her cheeks flushed from the chill. She looked like youth and rebellion in fine tailoring. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, as she stepped inside, removing her gloves with elegance. Vivian blinked at her, uncertain, but Eleanor continued as if they had been friends for years. "I came because I heard you'd vanished from every guest list in town, and when society begins to whisper, I prefer to go straight to the source." They took tea in the conservatory, the warmth of the room a welcome contrast to the cold outside. Steam rose gently from porcelain cups as Eleanor spoke of parties, of carriages overturned in the mud, of old widows hunting for new husbands. Vivian listened at first, unsure if she was being mocked, but Eleanor's laughter was genuine, her tone sincere, and slowly Vivian allowed herself to soften. "I don't belong here," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the swirling liquid in her cup. Eleanor tilted her head. "Why? Because your last name wasn't carved into granite before the war?" Vivian hesitated. "Because I married a man I don't understand." Eleanor's gaze became gentler. "Then you're not so different from the rest of us." They met again days later, this time in town. Eleanor invited her to walk through Redwood Library, where whispers could not reach them. There, amid ancient books and polished wood, she spoke openly for the first time. "People loved Catherine Blackwell," Eleanor said, running her fingers along a shelf. "She was beautiful, educated, charming. Her presence at any gathering made it worthwhile." Vivian turned slowly. "You knew her well?" "I knew her enough," Eleanor replied. "Enough to know the woman she showed to the world wasn't the one she showed to her husband." Vivian's breath caught. Eleanor continued, softer now. "Catherine wasn't cruel with her words. She didn't need to be. She could make someone feel small just by watching them for too long. She had a gift for finding a person's weakness and pressing it lightly, always smiling." Vivian felt her fingers tighten around the spine of the book she held. "I remember once," Eleanor said. "She humiliated a young girl during a dinner party. The girl had worn gloves with a tiny tear. Catherine noticed, of course. She didn't say a word, just reached over during the toast and tucked the torn corner back into place. With this slow, deliberate gesture, the girl didn't speak the rest of the night." "And Henry?" Vivian whispered. Eleanor looked at her directly. "He was not the man he is now. He smiled more, spoke more, but as the months passed, he began to vanish, even when he was in the room." Vivian swallowed hard. "And her death?" Eleanor's voice dropped. "Officially, an accident. She slipped from the east terrace. The stones were wet, but people talk. There were arguments, voices raised. No one knows for certain, and no one dares ask." Vivian turned away, her thoughts spiraling. That evening she walked the halls alone once more, passing by the east wing. The doors remained closed, the rooms locked, the silence unbearable. As she descended to the lower corridor, she caught sight of Henry through the glass of the smoking lounge door. He was not alone. A man sat across from him, tall and immaculately dressed in a burgundy frock coat with gold cufflinks that caught the firelight. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, Vivian could see even from the hallway, were sharp, watching Henry with the casual cruelty of a man used to getting what he wanted. Jonathan Pierce. She had heard the name whispered in passing, a financier, a rival, a man with ambition sharp enough to draw blood. Henry's voice was low and measured, but his hand curled tightly around his glass. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, a smile tugging at his lips, and placed a document on the table between them. Vivian didn't stay to hear more. She stepped away from the door and vanished into the corridor, her heart racing. Later that night, Henry returned to the estate long after midnight. Vivian, still awake, heard the carriage wheels grind to a halt and the front door open softly. She did not rise to greet him, but she watched from behind the curtain as he walked across the courtyard toward the garden, alone, hands in his coat pockets, his shoulders heavy with whatever weight he carried. The man she had married was a stranger, but he was a stranger cloaked in secrets, burdened by the memory of a wife he would not speak of, and chained to the very world he had pretended to escape. And she, once only a seamstress, now stood at the threshold of a life that felt more like a maze than a marriage. The first fracture had formed, and though no glass had shattered, Vivian could already hear the cracks widening in the silence between them. The invitation arrived on ivory paper, embossed with gold leaves and scented with rosewater. It came sealed with the crimson crest of Rosemore Hall, the Harcourt family estate, and carried with it the weight of unspoken judgment. It was not an olive branch. It was a summons. The Masquerade Ball, an annual tradition among Newport's elite, was to be held on the first Friday of October, a celebration of opulence beneath the veil of anonymity. Masks would hide the faces, but not the truths that simmered beneath them. Vivian, standing in the great vestibule of the Blackwell estate, with the envelope in her hand, felt the weight of the invitation like iron. She hadn't attended a single event in over a month. Her absence had become its own spectacle. to return now, to walk into a ballroom filled with the very people who whispered behind fans and raised crystal flutes in mockery of her marriage, felt almost theatrical. But Eleanor Whitmore had been clear. "You must go," she had insisted gently. "They feed off your silence. Give them a reason to look away." The gown arrived the next day. It was unlike anything Vivian had ever worn. Midnight green satin, sleek and heavy, with an off-the-shoulder neckline edged in delicate black lace. The bodice was tailored to her form, structured yet fluid, while the skirt billowed with each step like the swell of a dark sea. Alongside it came elbow-length gloves, a feathered mask adorned with emerald crystals, and a note in Eleanor's handwriting. "Let them see you, not as the girl they judged, but as the woman they cannot touch." Henry said nothing when the invitation was brought to his attention. Over breakfast, he merely folded the paper and set it aside. "You don't have to go," he said, sipping his coffee. Vivian looked at him from across the long dining table. "But I will." He met her eyes. For the first time in days, his gaze lingered. The evening of the ball, Rosemore Hall glittered like a palace. Lanterns floated in the gardens. The strains of a waltz spilled through the open doors, mingling with the scent of jasmine and champagne. Carriages lined the driveway like a procession of royalty, and masked guests poured into the marble foyer in gowns of gold, ruby, and sapphire. Vivian stepped from her carriage with her heart pounding, heads turned. Her gown caught the light with every step, the dark green silk reflecting shades of obsidian and ivy. The mask concealed half her face, but not her presence. She moved as if she belonged, chin raised, shoulders back. The whispers began immediately, but this time they stumbled. She entered the ballroom alone. The chandeliers above sparkled like constellations. 100 masked figures moved in elegant swirls across the polished floor. Laughter echoed like music over crystal. The air pulsed with secrets. She did not see Henry at first, but he saw her. He stood near the orchestra, masked in black, dressed in a formal tailcoat with a gold-trimmed cravat. He had arrived separately, a choice they had both made in silence. But now, as their eyes met across the gilded room, something shifted. The music changed, and then he was in front of her, extending his hand. "May I?" Vivian hesitated only a moment, then placed her gloved hand in his. The dance began. It was a slow waltz, haunting and sensual. The world fell away as they moved together, his hand at the small of her back, her fingers resting lightly on his shoulder. Their bodies glided across the marble floor, perfectly in step, the distance between them measured in breaths. They said nothing, but in their silence, everything was spoken. When the music faded, Henry bowed low. Vivian curtsied. For a heartbeat the room held its breath. Then the spell broke, and with it came the voice. "Such a stunning sight, the Blackwells," called Mrs. Prudence Harcourt, her tone sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. The crowd turned, the music stilled. Mrs. Harcourt stood at the edge of the ballroom staircase, resplendent in a crimson gown, her mask perched above eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "How lovely to see you both here tonight," she continued, descending slowly, "especially given the rumors. So many whispers of ruin, of retreat. But now we know, don't we?" Henry stiffened. Vivian's breath caught. "Mrs." Harcourt reached the bottom step, her voice louder now. "You see, my dear guests, the story we've all been told, that Mr. Blackwell suffered devastating losses, withdrew from society, and married quietly for companionship, turns out to be a performance worthy of the theatre." A hush fell across the room. Mrs. Harcourt smiled like a woman delivering a eulogy she had written herself. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "has not lost a cent. In fact, he controls more of Wall Street than half the men in this room combined. He has simply been playing a different game, one hidden behind closed doors, behind masks." A murmur swept the ballroom. All eyes turned to Henry. Vivian looked at him, her heart pounding. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was tight, his breath shallow. He removed his mask slowly. "I did what I had to," he said, his voice carrying. Mrs. Harcourt's smile did not fade. "So you admit it?" "I admit," he said, "that I chose silence over spectacle, that I built something worth protecting, and that I miscalculated the cost of trust." Vivian felt the room spin. Her hands trembled. Henry turned to her, but she stepped back before he could speak. "You knew this would happen," she whispered. "You let me walk in here blind." "Vivian," he said, his voice breaking ever so slightly. She didn't wait. She turned, skirts sweeping behind her, and walked out of the ballroom. The air outside was bitter and sharp. She crossed the gravel drive with hurried steps, tears blurring her vision, her gloves soaked from gripping them too tightly. Inside, the music resumed. The scandal was born, and in the eyes of society, Vivian Blackwell became something new. Not the seamstress who had married a ruined man, but the woman used as a shield by the most powerful player in the room. As the carriage doors closed behind her and the horses carried her into the night, she sat in silence, back straight, hands folded. Not a single tear fell. Not yet. Because something inside her had fractured again. Not from betrayal alone, but from the knowledge that Henry Blackwell had trusted the world with his secrets before he trusted her with his truth. The carriage rolled through the misty streets of Newport with the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoing against the cobblestones. Inside, Vivian sat in complete silence, her back pressed stiffly against the velvet upholstery, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. The mask she had worn at the masquerade lay beside her like a discarded lie, the emerald crystals catching the street lamp's glow and reflecting it in cold fragments. She did not cry. Not when the truth had shattered before her in front of Newport's finest. Not when the whispers turned from curiosity to scandal. Not when she had seen Henry Blackwell remove his mask with a composure she could no longer recognize. Only when the carriage turned onto Chapel Street, where the homes were smaller and the windows shuttered early, did she feel her breath begin to tremble. She asked the driver to stop 2 blocks before her destination. She stepped down alone, lifting the hem of her gown to avoid the puddles, and walked through the fog like a woman fleeing a burning house. The old boarding house had not changed. The scent of coal smoke and damp brick welcomed her like a memory. Her room, though narrow and sparsely furnished, felt like a refuge from the marble halls and silent glances of the estate. She removed the satin gown with slow, mechanical movements, folded it with care, and placed it in the drawer of the pine armoire. It no longer belonged to her. That night she lay awake in the narrow bed with the wool blanket pulled to her chin, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The silence was different here, less oppressive, more honest. There was no marble beneath her feet, no portraits watching from the walls, no locked drawers, no secret ledgers, just the soft tick of a second-hand clock and the distant whistle of a ship leaving the harbour. But the ache in her chest remained. By the 3rd day the whispers had reached the boarding house. The landlady, a round woman with sharp instincts and sharper opinions, hovered at the door with her tea. "They say he lied to everyone," she said without being asked, "that he's richer than the Vanderbilts but pretended to be a pauper just to pull the strings from behind the curtain." Vivian said nothing. The landlady hesitated. "If you want me to send a message to the estate—" "No," Vivian said quickly, "don't." She ventured out only to the corner market and back. Her gloves hid the tremble in her hands. Her veil, lowered over her face, shielded her from stares. Even Eleanor's letters, delivered faithfully, remained unopened on the desk. She did not want sympathy. She wanted understanding. She wanted an apology. She wanted to stop feeling like the walls of the estate were still pressing against her chest. It was on the evening of the 5th day that he came. The knock was soft. 2 quick raps, then silence. Vivian stood at the mirror, her hair half pinned, her shawl draped over her shoulders. She stared at her reflection. Pale cheeks, weary eyes, and something else, something she had not yet named. When she opened the door, Henry stood there. His dark coat was wet from the rain. His hair, always so carefully combed, hung damp across his forehead. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. She did not step aside. "I had to see you," he said quietly. Vivian lifted her chin. "You saw enough of me last week." "I didn't know she would do it." "Not like that." Her expression did not change. "You knew she would say something." Henry nodded. "Yes, but not to make you a spectacle. That I never intended." Vivian folded her arms. "What did you intend, Henry? To let me parade into a ballroom unarmed while the wolves tore the truth from your mouth?" He flinched at that. "I didn't want you caught in it, and yet I was." The silence that followed stretched between them like a tight wire. He exhaled slowly. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered the narrow room, taking in the worn furnishings, the faint scent of lavender soap. It was a world far removed from chandeliers and conservatories, a world she had once belonged to without shame. He stood near the small fireplace, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how," he began, "and because I didn't trust myself to say it without sounding like the man they think I am." Vivian turned away, her fingers brushing the edge of the windowsill. "I crafted my downfall, yes, but not to deceive you, to survive." He looked at her. "You think wealth brings power. It doesn't. It brings attention, expectation, envy. And when Catherine died, I didn't want any of it anymore." She turned slowly. "Tell me." Henry closed his eyes, as if gathering breath was harder than speaking. "It was raining. The terrace was slick. We argued. Again, about nothing and about everything. She said things, cruel things, and I answered in kind." She stepped back, turned to leave, and her heel caught the edge of the stone. "I reached for her." His voice broke. "I reached for her," he whispered, "but I was too late." Vivian stared at him, stunned. The fall killed her instantly. There was no time to scream, no time to beg, only silence. He stepped closer. The world mourned her like a saint. No one saw what she was behind closed doors. No one saw what she turned me into. And I let them believe what they wanted, because silence was easier than war. Vivian's eyes shimmered, but she did not move. "I never meant to bring you into that silence," he said. "But the moment I saw you, so still, so proud, even when they dismissed you, I thought, maybe you could live beside the quiet." She looked at him with something torn between grief and understanding. "You thought I would be too grateful to ask questions." "No," he said. "I thought you would ask them, and that I wouldn't know how to answer." Vivian lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. "You should have trusted me." Henry took another step forward, slow, careful. "I'm asking now." She lifted her eyes to his. "I can't forgive you tonight," she said softly. "I know. And I may never forget how it felt to be humiliated, to be used. I would never use you, Vivian." "You already did." Henry reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the table. She didn't touch it. "I've transferred the deed to a property outside Providence. It's yours. No conditions, no obligations." Vivian frowned. "Why?" "Because if you walk away, you should never have to return to needle and thread." Her eyes searched his. "And if I don't walk away?" He said nothing. But in the way he looked at her, in the tightness of his throat, in the unspoken tremble in his gaze, the answer hovered between them like a held breath. Vivian turned back to the window, listening to the soft patter of rain against the glass. Behind her, Henry remained silent. She did not ask him to stay, and he did not expect her to. But as he left, and the door closed quietly behind him, the first ember of something fragile and human flickered in the ashes of betrayal. She stood alone in the dim firelight, the envelope untouched, and felt the first warmth in days creep slowly back into her frozen hands. Autumn descended over Newport with a chill that seemed to seep not only through the windows and into the bone, but through every whispered conversation, every headline inked in sharp black across society pages. The scandal at the masquerade ball had left ripples far beyond the dance floor of Rosemore Hall. Now those ripples had become waves, and the tide was rising fast against Henry Blackwell. In the days that followed, the newspapers had turned merciless. The phantom financier of Beechwood, a pauper's mask hiding a fortune. Was Mrs. Blackwell deceived too? Jonathan Pierce, whose name had long circulated in business salons and brokerage houses with equal parts admiration and suspicion, had seized the moment. With his neatly pressed cravats and silver-tipped walking cane, he now made the rounds through parlours and press rooms, offering carefully worded condemnations masked as concern. "It is not a man's wealth that offends," he said in one published interview, "but the manner in which it is concealed. Society thrives on trust. Without it, even the richest empire is made of sand." Behind that genteel phrasing was a weapon. Stocks tied to Henry's holdings began to drop. Silent partners withdrew. Rumors spread of forged accounts, hidden transactions, shadow companies. And amid it all, Vivian remained at the boarding house. The envelope with the deed sat untouched on her nightstand. She read each paper, she heard each name, and for the first time she saw the storm not only as Henry's burden, but as her own. It was Eleanor Whitmore who came to her again, this time without fanfare, stepping into the dim hallway of the boarding house with urgency in her breath and fire in her eyes. "You have to speak," Eleanor said, removing her gloves with sharp, impatient tugs. "They're tearing him apart. Pierce is orchestrating it all like a puppet show, and everyone is dancing to his tune." Vivian shook her head. "What could I possibly say that they'd believe? You were his wife when he was supposedly ruined. You know the truth, and not just about his money, but his heart. That's what they don't understand." Vivian looked away. "I'm not sure I understand it myself." Eleanor stepped forward. "You don't have to forgive him to fight beside him. You just have to decide if you still believe he's worth protecting." That night, Vivian opened the drawer in the small desk where she had kept the letters and records from her time in the estate. Among them were Henry's ledgers, which she had once hidden in anger, then guarded in silence. She opened them again now, not to accuse but to understand. The numbers weren't just calculations, they were a map of careful strategy, protection, caution. Henry hadn't hidden his empire to deceive. He had hidden it to survive the vultures who now circled above, and he had done it alone. Until now. 2 days later, she stood before a room filled with Newport's elite. The occasion was the Whitmore Charity Luncheon, an annual event that raised funds for widows of the Merchant Marine. Vivian had declined the invitation 3 years in a row, but this time her arrival caused a stir before she even opened her mouth. She wore a gown of steel-grey silk, elegant and sober, with jet buttons and a simple brooch at her collar. Her hair was swept back in a dignified chignon, and her only adornment was a thin black ribbon at her wrist, a subtle reminder of mourning, of memory, of resolve. The chatter ceased as she stepped to the front of the hall. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply began. "When I first entered this town as a seamstress, many of you looked through me. A murmur. I was invisible. Useful perhaps, but not seen, not heard." She paused, letting her voice settle over the hush. "When I married Henry Blackwell, I stepped into your world. I was not prepared, and I was not always welcomed, but I saw something you did not. I saw a man who had been silenced by grief, disfigured by scandal, and worn down by the very power you all claim to covet." She looked directly at Mrs. Harcourt, whose fan had stilled in her lap. He did not fall. He chose silence over spectacle, discretion over dominance. And yes, he withheld truths, but what has Jonathan Pierce offered you in return for your outrage? Nothing but words dressed as virtue, no records, no service, only smoke and mirrors. Gasps, whispers. A few eyes turned nervously toward the back, where Pierce's associate stood rigid, pale. Vivian pressed forward. "I have seen the ledgers, the real ones. I know every transaction, every investment. I know what he saved and what he sacrificed." She softened, her voice trembling only slightly. "You see a mask. I see the man who wore it to survive a world that delights in tearing down what it cannot control. Eleanor stood. Her example brought 3 more women to their feet, then 5. By the time Vivian stepped back, the room had changed. The applause did not thunder, but it echoed, and it mattered. That evening, Vivian returned not to the boarding house, but to the estate. The front door opened before she could knock. Henry stood in the threshold, eyes red, collar undone, a telegram still clenched in his hand. She did not speak at first. He stared at her like a man not sure if she was real. "I heard," he said finally. "They told me what you said. I didn't do it for them," she replied softly. "Then why?" She stepped forward. "Because no one else would." He exhaled, the sound more like a sob than a sigh. "Vivian, I don't deserve—" "I didn't come back for what you deserve," she interrupted. "I came back because the world wants to see you fall, and I will not stand in their gallery and let them applaud it." He closed his eyes. His hands trembled. "You're not here as my wife, are you?" She took another step. "I'm here as a woman who refuses to be used, and as a woman who chooses to fight. If I stay, it will not be beside you in silence. It will be beside you in battle." Henry looked at her, the lines of his face etched deeper than ever, but softened now by something that had nothing to do with money or pride. "Then I have already won," he whispered. Vivian did not smile, but her presence, her strength, her voice, became the calm at the eye of the storm. And in that stillness, for the first time since the masquerade, Henry dared to hope that something more than fortune had returned to him that night. The first frost clung to the hedges of Beechwood Avenue, glazing the wrought-iron gates of Newport's grandest estates with a shimmer that turned morning into crystal. The once lush gardens surrounding the Blackwell estate had surrendered to the cold, but from the upper balcony, the world below still looked like something from a painting, silent, still, and holding its breath. Inside the drawing room, the hearth crackled softly. Vivian stood before it, her hands resting on the mantel, her eyes unfocused as she listened to the rhythm of the fire. She wore a pale lavender wool gown, modest and finely cut, the sort of garment that whispered elegance rather than announced it. Her hair was swept up with a few loose curls framing her face, and there was no jewelry on her neck, no brooch to draw attention. Henry entered quietly, a newspaper folded beneath his arm. He had not shaved yet, and a touch of weariness clung to his eyes, but the sharpness in his posture had softened. The man who once held his secrets close to his chest now wore them more like a scar, visible, undeniable, and no longer a source of shame. He paused when he saw her, unsure if she'd heard his approach. "You're up early," he said gently. She turned. "The frost woke me. It reminded me of the first time I saw this house from the road. It looked cold then, too." Henry gave a small nod. "And now?" Vivian met his gaze, searching for the shadows that once lingered in it. They were still there, but softer, quieter. "Now it feels like mine." That quiet declaration held more weight than any apology could. In the weeks that followed her public defense of him, the tide in Newport began, slowly, to turn. Not with cheers or banners, but with glances that grew less sharp, invitations that once arrived reluctantly now addressed directly to Mrs. Vivian Blackwell. Her presence at charity gatherings no longer caused raised brows, and the silence she once met in drawing rooms had given way to cautious, if curious, conversation. Yet it was not society's forgiveness she had sought. It was Henry's, and perhaps her own. They began to spend their mornings together in the solarium, sipping tea while the light filtered through the fogged glass. She asked him questions now, the kind she once feared might break something delicate between them. He answered with honesty. About Catherine, about the years after her death, about the names in the ledgers and the weight of an empire built with no one to share it with. "I never intended to be alone this long," he confessed one evening, as they walked through the conservatory, where the roses had withered into dry husks. But when silence becomes survival, it's difficult to let it go. Vivian brushed her fingertips across a dried petal. "You didn't let it go. You let me in." He looked at her then with something raw in his expression. Not gratitude, not adoration, but something deeper. Recognition. Still, the world outside their estate had not forgotten so easily. Jonathan Pierce, though careful in public, had been unraveling behind closed doors. The financial web he had spun, investments built on exaggerated holdings and empty partnerships, was collapsing. Newspapers that once quoted him now questioned him. His name began to appear beside words like fraud and embezzlement, and rumors of federal charges gained momentum. It was at a private luncheon hosted by the Whitmore family, with several of Newport's most respected families in attendance, that the final blow came. Mrs. Prudence Harcourt, dressed in mourning black despite the absence of any recent bereavement, was seated near the head of the table. Her eyes, sharp as ever, flicked toward Vivian with restrained contempt. The conversation turned, elegantly as always, to the state of the market. Someone mentioned Henry's return to public visibility. Another remarked on the sudden quiet surrounding Pierce. Then a younger gentleman, one of the new money guests seeking to impress, cleared his throat. "Well, it's no wonder Mr. Pierce has gone into hiding," he said with a smirk. "After the Harcourt Trust's debacle, no one dares admit they were ever in business with him." The room fell still. Mrs. Harcourt's teacup froze mid-air. Vivian did not move. She only watched. "I beg your pardon," Mrs. Harcourt said, her tone clipped. The young man blinked. "You mean you haven't heard? Your son, Thomas, he was one of the primary signatories on the Boston holding company that collapsed last week. It was in the Providence Tribune, a full column." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mrs. Harcourt set her cup down without a word. The tremor in her fingers did not go unnoticed. Vivian held her gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, only clarity. The storm had broken. That evening, Henry returned from a meeting in town, his coat damp from a light snow, and his expression unreadable. "She knows now," he said as he stepped into the study where Vivian was writing correspondence. "Mrs. Harcourt, everyone does." Vivian looked up. "And Jonathan? Under investigation. He's left the state." She nodded once, folded her letter and sealed it. Henry watched her with something between awe and quiet reverence. "You changed the course of this," he said. "Not me, not my money, not my silence." Vivian stood and crossed to him. She adjusted the collar of his coat, fingers lingering briefly over the velvet lapel. "I didn't come back to be your ornament, Henry, and I won't stay as your shadow." "You aren't," he said. "You never were." Their eyes held. No promises were exchanged, no vows. But the room around them no longer felt filled with tension. It felt full, with something new, something shared. That night in the drawing room they sat beside the fire, Henry with a book unopened on his lap, Vivian with embroidery in hand. Neither spoke for a long time. Then, as the embers dimmed, Henry broke the silence. "Would you do it again?" he asked. Vivian looked at him. "What? Marry me?" She hesitated, then smiled, not with irony but with gentleness. "I think," she said, "I would choose you, but this time I would want to know who you were." Henry nodded. "And I would want to know who you were willing to become." Outside, the snow began to fall softly, blanketing the gardens and the rooftop with quiet insistence. And inside, beneath the warm flicker of firelight and the weight of unspoken understanding, two souls who had once stood on opposite ends of silence now sat side by side in a home they had learned to build, not with fortune, but with forgiveness. Winter had passed with quiet dignity, leaving behind a world softened by snowmelt and touched with early signs of spring. Newport, though still wrapped in the elegance of its Gilded Age splendor, had grown quieter with the season's retreat. But inside the Blackwell estate, preparations stirred with the kind of anticipation that could not be hushed. The ballroom, once silent and shadowed for nearly 2 years, now pulsed with renewed life. Candles had been lit early, and by twilight their flames reflected in the crystal chandeliers, cascading golden light across the polished floors. Musicians tuned their instruments behind velvet curtains. Servants in formal livery moved with elegant purpose. Dozens of floral arrangements in ivory and plum adorned the grand staircase and the carved mantelpieces, breathing perfume into every corner of the house. At the heart of it all stood Vivian Blackwell, no longer a guest in this world of privilege, but its host. She descended the main staircase slowly, her hand gliding along the banister. She wore a gown of deep amethyst satin, its off-the-shoulder neckline framed by soft black lace and a delicate string of pearls at her collarbone. Her hair, gathered into a sleek twist, was held with a silver comb encrusted with onyx, and in her gloved hand she carried a fan made of peacock feathers and lace. The guests below turned to watch her, not with suspicion, not with judgment, with admiration. A murmur passed through the crowd. It was her first grand appearance since the scandal had turned in her favor. But more than that, it was her first as Lady Blackwell in the truest sense of the title. No longer the seamstress thrust into society, no longer the whispered curiosity. Now she was the woman who had faced fire and returned with grace intact. At the foot of the stairs waited Henry, dressed in a tailored black tailcoat with a silver waistcoat and perfectly knotted cravat. He did not reach for her hand, not in the presence of so many eyes, but as she approached him, he bowed, not just out of formality, but with reverence. "You look," he said softly, "as though this house has waited for you its entire life." Vivian's lips curved. Perhaps it has. The guests began to flow around them, greetings exchanged, hands kissed, laughter rising in bright crescendos. Music filled the air, light waltzes, delicate chamber pieces. The scent of roasted chestnut and champagne drifted from the adjoining salons, where waiters moved with practiced grace. Vivian moved through it all with calm confidence. She greeted old names and new ones, her eyes never betraying the nerves that tightened faintly in her chest. Each guest who approached her offered polite congratulations, remarks on her poise, her gown, her charity efforts. No one mentioned her origins. No one dared, because she had turned what they once used against her into her greatest strength. From across the ballroom, Henry watched her. She had changed him, not with lectures or tears, but with presence, with silence when words failed. With the way she had stood in front of the world, not beside him, but in defense of him. When others would have walked away, she had chosen to stay, and to stay loudly. And now, as he watched her laugh softly at some comment from a senator's wife, he felt something he had not known in years. Pride, not in himself, in her. The hours passed in a graceful rhythm. Later that evening, as the guests were ushered into the dining hall, the ballroom fell momentarily quiet. Henry stood near the tall windows, gazing out at the snow-dusted garden bathed in moonlight. Vivian approached without a sound. Her gloved hand brushed lightly against his arm. "You haven't danced once tonight," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For the right song." She looked up at him, the corners of her eyes warm with memory. "I believe the musicians are ready." He turned to her, his expression unreadable, and offered his arm. They stepped into the center of the ballroom just as the orchestra began to play. The first notes rose gently, familiar, haunting, and full of the melancholy beauty of winter's end. Vivian froze. She knew that melody. It had once been Catherine's, played at countless soirees, favored, requested, remembered. It had lingered like a perfume long after her death, a shadow that hung in the corners of the house. But now, it felt different. Vivian looked at Henry. "Are you certain?" His voice was low, tender. "This is no longer hers. This is yours." And then they danced. The guests, returning from the dining hall, paused in the archways to watch. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The candlelight played over their joined hands, the slow sway of her gown, the graceful turn of their bodies in perfect sync. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back. Her fingers curved against his shoulder. Their eyes met only once, and in that single glance, everything that had passed between them was both remembered and forgiven. When the music ended, the room erupted in gentle applause, but the world for them had already fallen silent. Later that night, long after the last guest had left and the candles had burned low, Vivian stood barefoot on the marble balcony outside the ballroom. The cold air kissed her skin, but she did not shiver. She heard footsteps behind her. Henry joined her without speaking. He held a small box in his hand, wrapped in cream satin ribbon. He placed it in hers. "What is this?" she asked, already knowing. He waited as she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay a ring. Not the one she wore now, not the heavy emerald and diamond heirloom of the Blackwell name. This one was simple. A delicate gold band set with a single sapphire, deep blue and unpretentious. "I had it made for you," he said, "not as an emblem of this house, not as a replacement, but as a beginning." Vivian stared down at it. "It's beautiful." He took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "Vivian," he said softly, "this is not an arrangement. Not anymore. This is a promise, mine to you." She looked up at him, her breath caught between gratitude and wonder. "And mine to you," she whispered. They stood together beneath the moonlight, their hands clasped, the music from the ballroom now only an echo in the air. Behind them, the grand house, once filled with silence and shadows, now pulsed with warmth. And in that final, perfect stillness, Vivian Blackwell, once unseen, once whispered about, had become more than a wife, more than a name. She had become the master's equal. And as the final candle flickered out in the ballroom behind them, the melody they had danced to, once Catherine's, belonged fully, irrevocably, to Vivian. 10 years had passed since the night of the grand charity ball. The night when the world had seen Vivian Blackwell not as an outsider, not as a scandal, but as a woman who had earned her place in marble halls with nothing but truth and quiet strength. The world had changed since then. The roaring tide of the new century was beginning to stir. Trains cut faster through the countryside. The skyline of New York, once dominated by steeples, now bore steel and ambition. Women began to gather in parlors to speak not only of fashion or suitors, but of votes and voices. And yet at Blackwell House, a timelessness lingered. The gardens had grown fuller, richer. The stone lions that guarded the front steps were softened by moss. The ballroom was used more often now, not for grand affairs, but for laughter, for music lessons, for birthday cakes and waltzes between father and daughter. Yes, daughter. A little girl with chestnut curls and her mother's steady eyes. Margaret Eleanor Blackwell was 8 now, all questions and mischief, lace gloves and dirt-stained boots. She adored horses and her piano in equal measure, and she had her father utterly in her power. Vivian watched them from the upstairs window one crisp autumn afternoon. Margaret riding ahead on her grey pony, Henry walking beside her, pretending not to worry every time the reins slipped in her small hands. He had greyed at the temples, just slightly. A few lines had deepened around his eyes, but his presence, his mind, his quiet command of every room, none of it had faded. And his love had not waned. Not once. Not when Vivian had suffered a difficult birth. Not when she chose to open reading schools for orphaned girls. Not even when society, briefly, recoiled again, whispering that a Blackwell daughter ought not to share classrooms with children from immigrant families. He had supported her in every battle, every cause, every heartbreak, and together they had built a life that no contract could have predicted. Eleanor Pierce, once the queen of whispered scorn, had left Newport quietly after her son's ruin. Jonathan Pierce had been sentenced to federal prison after his schemes collapsed in scandalous public trials. He lost everything, his name, his wealth, his future. Vivian had once feared Eleanor's cruelty, but now she simply pitied her. Power gained through manipulation had no roots. It could not survive a storm. Others had risen in her place, new names, new fortunes. But the old guard of Newport, those who remembered, still nodded with solemn respect whenever Lady Blackwell entered a room. She had outlasted them all. That winter, on the eve of their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry brought Vivian to the ballroom once again. No guests, no fanfare, just the two of them. The musicians played from the gallery, soft and low. The same waltz from that first true night of theirs echoed once more through the candlelit chamber. Vivian wore a simple blue gown. Her hair, streaked now with elegant silver, swept into the same twist she'd worn that night, long ago. Henry took her in his arms with the same reverence, the same intensity as he had before. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, her head against his shoulder. "Which part?" "The arrangement." He smiled, tracing the curve of her spine with a familiarity that had never lost its reverence. "It brought me you," he said. "So no, not even for a moment." They danced, not as master and wife, not as symbols or survivors, but as lovers who had weathered life's seasons together, spring's innocence, summer's fire, autumn's golden trials, and now, in winter's gentle hush, they stood stronger than ever. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, a little girl giggled somewhere down the corridor, calling for her nursemaid. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, not of longing, but of fullness. She had once been a seamstress with calloused fingers and no place in the world but her sewing stool. Now she was the mother of a daughter who would inherit not only a title, but a legacy of courage. She was the wife of a man who had learned that wealth without love was nothing. She was the mistress of a house that had once belonged to another woman, and yet now bore her touch in every polished banister, every tapestry, every late-blooming rose in the garden. And as they turned slowly across the ballroom floor, Vivian knew that no tale truly ended. It simply grew deeper, richer, with time. Like love, like music, like her. In a world ruled by appearances and secrets, Vivian and Henry taught us that true love isn't born from perfection. It's forged through storms, stitched together by honesty, resilience, and the courage to begin again. Their journey reminds us that what others call a scandal might just be the beginning of something beautiful, that quiet strength can outshine power, and that healing often begins when we dare to see someone, not for who they were, but for who they're becoming. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or stirred something in your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who believes in second chances, or someone who needs one. And if you made it all the way here, write the word resilience in the comments. That way I'll know you were with me until the final waltz. And together we'll keep this little corner of timeless love alive. Don't forget to check the cards for more stories like this, full of longing, redemption, and the quiet triumph of love over all. Thank you for listening and for believing.